welcome to Sorting Myself Out. My name is Ryan Holsapple. Yesterday, Joe Rogan released a podcast. Every once in a while, I pop those on to listen, especially when an intellectual is on. Brian Greene is a physicist. He came on and shared some interesting ideas. I thought it was a good podcast, and something really caught my attention that I want to share with you all today. He talked about religion. And I want to share a clip with you to kind of get into some of my ideas and responses and how that relates to Carl Jung's idea on the religious instinct or the religious function. So without further ado, I'm going to dive right in here to this video.
We don't agree in totality. But I was saying to him, there are times I go around the world and I will do things that are utterly irrational. I'll knock on wood for good luck. I'll speak to my dead father. I know that he's not really there. I'll pray to God on occasion if I think that I could use that backup. Not because I think there's some bearded individual.
Just this part right here is really interesting to me. So throughout the whole podcast, this guy is a dyed-in-the-wool rationalist, okay? So for him, the basics of explaining everything is at the molecular level. There is no, there is no magic behind it. It's very simple. Our human experience is composed of neurochemicals, and he just believes that. However, he was very gratuitous in his ability to understand the religious impulse, to understand how, for some reason, human beings need this type of being. We called it in the last video where I commented on Sam Harris' recent comments on Jordan Peterson, we called it the mythopoetic imagination. So I thought it was so fitting that this came out right after that video. And let's see what he has to say next, because I think you'll find it really interesting. But so far, what we have is he's making it clear that, okay, I'm a rationalist. I don't really believe in this stuff, but I still knock on wood. I still find myself praying sometimes. Let's keep going.
In the sky, it's just a behavioral tendency that I find to be comforting and useful. And I said this to Richard, and he said, I totally get it. I was like, what? He was like, I totally get it. He said, in fact, I don't like to sleep in a house that has a reputation as being haunted.
And he's talking about he gave a talk with Richard Dawkins.
And for me, it was such a beautiful human moment. It was such a beautiful human moment where we were just like being human beings.
Right.
And then he said, we're both sinners. And I agree. We are both sinners.
It's so funny. It's such a refreshing moment to have this scientist, this hardcore scientist, come out and say, yeah, Richard Dawkins and I, we still have these really irrational impulses psychologically to do things that we know in our field directly contradicts what we believe. Gosh, it was so refreshing. But really, and he talks about William James, obviously the original OG psychologist, and how William James wrote about religious experience and how important they have been for human beings throughout history. I want to bring in Carl Jung, though, because Carl Jung takes it even a step further and talks about the religious function or the religious instinct, that there is something deeply inside, embedded within the psyche, that moves towards this deep relationship with the unknown, that projects something within itself onto a creator, onto gods and demigods and mythologies, and that this, what I was calling in the last video, poetic style of consciousness, is what these structured religions and mythologies really come out of. It's because we have this innate instinct. It's there with us a priori. So I think that that's a fascinating thing to consider as we are in this new time in society where we are post-enlightenment. We are almost postmodern. We're heading towards this extreme technological advance, and at the same time, the advances of science are making it harder and harder to hold this mythopoetic lens that has been so dominant throughout history. And people who are rationalists and scientists like Brian Greene are helping us. When they say stuff like this, they're helping us bridge this gap. Let's keep listening here for a moment, and then we'll move on to some other things I want to watch with you here today.
In that sense, because we know how the world works. We know this doesn't make any sense. And yes, it's still part of somehow how we behave in the world. And I think there's a value to recognizing that that is what it means to be human. You will engage in the world in ways that are not necessarily strictly adhering to some rational perspective of how the scientific world operates.
I would love to see.
So let's listen to that part one more time because I think it's important.
Some rational perspective. How we behave in the world. And I think there's a value to recognizing that that is what it means to be human. You will engage in the world in ways that are not necessarily strictly adhering to some rational perspective of how the scientific world operates.
We'll engage in ways that aren't strictly adhering to rational perspectives. See, to me, this is honoring human psychology. We don't always act out of a rational, well thought out, scientific or reductionistic worldview. I mean, I don't know anybody who lives that way, really. And to honor this component of human existence that is spontaneous, creative, has a relationship to the unknown, has a non-linear way of seeing and being, I think is a really cool thing for a scientist to acknowledge, especially one of his ilk. So let's go ahead here and see what Rogan
I would
has
love
to
to
say.
see Richard Dawkins outside of a haunted house
Yeah,
saying,
right.
I'm not going in there.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not going in there. Joe is so funny.
Exactly. You know.
It's so ironic too. Richard Dawkins won't go into a haunted house. How hilarious is that?
Yeah. So you know, it's all just to say
Yeah.
that I kind of feel like there are many pathways toward insight in the world. There are many ways to live a life. There are many ways to come to terms with our own impermanence. And it's not as though something is right or something is wrong. It's a question of, is it useful to you?
Okay, and he talked about a lot in this podcast, the functionality of religion, how it helped us throughout our evolutionary process, how religion acted as a way to help us simulate life experiences and possibilities so that we were more adaptable, and that it did have a survival function. It did have an enhancing function to our existence. I really thought that was cool, taking it from an evolutionary perspective. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the next part, where I want to just take a look at Jordan Peterson's comments on the religious instinct. And I think you'll find this interesting as well. Obviously, for those of you who are fans of Jordan Peterson, this will come as no surprise, and you've probably heard it all before.
Seems to me so obvious that we have a religious instinct, because I can't think of what else you would possibly call that other than a religious instinct. You know, Nietzsche, when he proclaimed the death of God, which by the way was no triumphant proclamation, because he also mentioned that we would never find enough water to wash away the blood, which was his, what would you call it, prognostication for the 20th century. And a very accurate one at that. He believed that we would, in some sense, have to become as gods in ourselves in order to replace what we had lost. He thought.
So it's fascinating to think about how. Okay, so we have this religious instinct. Let's say, and within the human psyche, there's a need to have a relationship to a power greater than ourselves. Whether it's the great mystery, whether it's a Christian God, a Jewish God, the God of Islam, or a Native American spirituality, we have this deep need, and I won't speak for everybody, but I'll say generally speaking, there seems to be an emergent pattern where people have this deep need for a spiritual religious connection. And it arises out of the psyche. And Peterson talks about how he thinks that when it doesn't get fulfilled properly, it gets projected onto all sorts of ideologies like postmodernism, extreme groups, extreme beliefs that you're not willing to let go of. We tend to, if we don't fulfill our religious instinct, we tend to project it onto other things, political beliefs, events, structures. I think that that's really important to keep in mind. I want to read something to you from Carl Jung from his book Psychology and Religion. And I think it will put this all in more perspective. After all, this video is focused on Jung's idea of the religious instinct. Since I am going to present, and this is where the quote begins, since I am going to present a rather unusual argument, I cannot assume that my audience will be fully acquainted with the methodological standpoint of the branch of psychology I represent. This standpoint is exclusively phenomenological. That is, it is concerned with occurrences, events, experiences. In a word, with facts. Its truth is a fact and not a judgment. When psychology speaks, for instance, of the motif of the virgin birth, it is only concerned with the fact that there is such an idea, but it is not concerned with the question whether such an idea is true or false in any other sense. The idea is psychologically true, inasmuch as it exists. Psychological existence is subjective insofar as an idea occurs in only one individual, but it is objective insofar as that idea is shared by a society, by a consensus gentium. Okay, so what is he saying there? I'd like to know in the comments what you think. What I believe he's saying here, and I think it's pretty straightforward, is that in psychology we're looking at the direct phenomenon of what is being a human. And what is the direct phenomenon of being a human? Well, it seems that there's these religious ideas that emerge. So what you can say about the psyche is that it has a religious component, regardless of the objective truth of any such religious claims. It's often what my friend Mercury Black says. I have an angel. I don't know if it's actually real, but I know I experience it in my mind. I have this phenomenological experience with this angel. That is kind of what Jung is pointing to. It's looking at what is the psyche experiencing? How are we engaging our lives? Well, we seem to have these ideas emerge. And because of that, because we have these ideas emerge, we know that there's something deep inside of us that calls us to a higher power or to a religious mythopoetic worldview. It doesn't mean it has to be a particular religion or a particular mythology. It just means that within the psyche there is a tendency to mythologize. So let's read his next piece here. Religion appears to me to be a peculiar attitude of mind, which could be formulated in accordance with the original use of the word religio, which means a careful consideration and observation of certain dynamic factors that are conceived as powers, spirits, daemons, gods, laws, ideas, ideals, or whatever name man has given such factors in his world, as he has found powerful, dangerous, or helpful enough to be taken into consideration, or grand or beautiful, and meaningful enough to be devoutly worshipped. In colloquial speech, one often says, or devoutly worshipped and loved, In colloquial speech, one often says of somebody who is enthusiastically interested in a certain pursuit that he is almost doing it religiously. The quote cuts off. So you can see how that ties back into what Peterson was saying. We have this religious fascination with things, whether it be with a political doctrine or an actual religious idea. The psyche needs that religious component, that group-mindedness that loves to be involved. What Jonathan Haidt calls the hive mind, the hive switch in his book, The Righteous Mind, that there's this switch that turns on when we're in a circle of people who believe similar things that shifts us into a group consciousness. Now that's like the group religious function. There's also the individual relationship to God, like Lou Andres Salome, who I've been learning about recently in school, talks about, where she talks about her childhood and the experience of God in her childhood, how it was so deep and profound for her that God was like her imaginary best friend. Even though it wasn't the God being taught in these conventional churches, she still had this God character that she was closely related with. And she was also very close with Nietzsche as well, and they had some type of relationship going on for quite some time. So what are you all thinking here so far? I see you in the comments. I see Dust to Dust. I see Mercury Black. I see Shane Allen. I see Singularity. I see Carlo Puig. Sorry if I mispronounced that. I see Boy Meets World. Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad that you're here. Yes, I agree. Boy Meets World. Brian Greene did treat religion pretty well in that podcast, and I thought it was very interesting the way that he balanced his ideas. So let's watch that video a little more here, and I'll give you some more comments. Okay, here we go.
And I think that we have to be very open-minded in the kinds of behaviors that that we allow to happen in the world. Even Ramtha, it's nutty stuff.
Yeah.
But if some of those individuals who go there find that it allows them to live in the world in a more productive way, alleviating anxiety, feeling like they're on a spiritual quest, so be it. You know?
That's the thing that's
And you'll see how he's maintaining a scientific dominance. So he's not granting that the life of the soul is more true than the life of the material, measurable, scientific world. However, while he's not granting that, which many people would have a problem with, because to many of us, the life of the soul is the most important thing. It's the most real thing. After all, if we were to be phenomenologists like Carl Jung suggests, the most real thing we have is our direct experience, the life of our soul, the way that we imagine our lives, the way that we dream into our lives, the way that we reflect upon it moment to moment, and the different way that we psychologize each moment, the way that we see everything in any given moment. It's not from this materialistic, rational, Spockish lens. It's very much a spontaneous, generative force of being that happens all on its own. That's why Martin Heidegger often talks about the importance of poetry and the way that poetry is actually the best way about talking about what's true and what's real, because it has a way in to the soul and to the mind that is more phenomenologically pure. It's more true to how we experience life. Now, let's go to this next part.
I mean, it's hard for people to understand if you're not in that space, that headspace that they are. You don't need this structure. But for some people, even Scientology or something along those lines, it seems loopy on paper, can provide them with legitimate structure and benefit their lives in a tangible way that they could describe to you.
Yeah, exactly. And my feeling is that if there was
it can provide them with a legitimate structure that benefits their lives. See, I'm not sure Sam Harris has admitted that in his teachings on the damage of religion. I'm not sure about that, but I haven't seen him grant that territory. He seems to, what Harris, in my estimation, seems to be saying is that we could totally do without religion, or anything that isn't directly observably true through the methods of science. We could actually create a science of the mind that is mapping out the landscape of well-being, where we don't need to posit anything that's not falsifiable. We can simply know facts about well-being. We can know what makes human beings feel more connected, more alive, more joyous, and that we can create a science of the mind based on that. That's what Sam thinks. So in his opinion, we don't need any of this overly mythopoetic stuff. Now, I'm not sure if that is sustainable. What do you all think about that? I think that's an interesting take. I think that he's doing a lot of work to try to make that substantial, but I'm not sure, because to me, there seems to be something about the imaginative way of existing that holds a certain amount of weight, that when you just introduce a pure rationality, things start to dry up a little bit.
I don't know this to be the case, and maybe some biologists will push back on this, but if there was a race of, for want of a better word, Vulcan-like individuals who approach the world in a completely rational manner, evaluating the data, figuring out the most sensible course of action, competing against a crazy group of individuals like us who will come up with wild fictional ideas.
Well, and again, I don't know anyone who lives their life that way. I don't know anybody who, I know people who say they live their life that way, but even the research, again, we'll bring up Jonathan Haidt. The research is showing that people act on intuition, what they feel like they want. It's not rational, it's emotional, it's intuitive, it's based on feeling or different functions within the brain, within the psyche. And then they rationalize why they acted like. Ryan, why are you doing a podcast right now instead of doing your homework? Well, you see, I need to do a podcast right now because the timing of 1:54 in the afternoon is perfect for the algorithm, and it really is going to work out well for me if I do it this way. And I don't really study as well at 2 in the afternoon, so you see, that's why I'm doing a podcast right now. Bullshit. That's a post hoc rationalization. That's rationalizing an impulse, a deep instinct I wanted to act upon because there's a force moving within me that I can't always explain. These are the autonomous complexes of the psyche that Carl Jung talked about. The psyche is made up of subpersonalities that are not purely dominated by the force of our rational brains, that what tries to understand things and tries to cognitively develop rational reasons for things. It doesn't work that way. We have deep, what James Hillman calls the gods are within us. Or Carl Jung would say every psychological symptom for a neurosis has a god in it, meaning it has a subpersonality, a complex, something deeply embedded within that has its own agenda autonomously.
Gods in the heavens, demons haunting the world. I think it's the latter group that ultimately would triumph, because with that kind of freedom of thought, you get novelty,
yes.
You get ingenuity, you get creativity. And so I feel as though this is part and parcel of who we are and why we have survived. And to sort of come at the world with a scientific club that's meant to smash away anything that disagrees with the scientific worldview is an unfortunate way of looking at the world.
What a beautiful teacher, that he's so invested in science. He's so invested in his worldview, which is, again, he said several times in this podcast, your experience as a human being is based on chemicals in your body, okay? So he is reductionism to a T, okay? But to be able to still hold that and also say, no, it's not okay to just bulldoze over the religious perspective. It's actually something very precious about human life that might even be adaptive. It might even have a real deep evolutionary purpose. I think that's humility. I think Brian Greene is showing humility, because I don't think he really, like you said, he doesn't really believe in a religious worldview to any extent, whether it be spiritual, New Age, or fundamentalist. He's not buying it as something real, even though he observes himself acting in these ways. He observes that he has the impulse to knock on wood or to pray to God sometimes. That's a very interesting thing for him to admit. And anyway, so let's keep moving here. I want to share with you a couple of things from Jonathan Haidt that you might find interesting as well, because Haidt talks about the hive mind, and the hive mind is part of what we talked about earlier, that religious group experience. It's called the hive switch.
Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
And competition, he's got to explain why we are often so virtuous, cooperative, helpful. So he generates all kinds of clever reasons, and one of the ones that he generates is one he's trying to figure out. are shaped by group versus group.
So basically, he talks about this in his book. I'll just give you a quick introduction so you have some context. There is this thing that he calls the hive switch. In Darwinian and evolutionary theory, there's currently a dispute, and largely it is not believed by most experts, as far as I remember from his book, that there is any such thing as group selection. It's actually genes are selfish to a core, and they select for their own survival, and there's no such thing as group selection. Well, he makes an interesting case that there actually is some sort of group complex happening within the genome that is devoted towards a group experience, towards actually sacrificing oneself for the whole. And he talks about concerts, religious gatherings, all sorts of experiences where people lose their own sense of identity in this big organismic connectivity that happens. So there's your context, and so he has some interesting things to say about that.
Competition. And this gives us a kind of a hive-ish, groupish overlay that has not been appreciated by the social sciences or evolutionary biology. That's my big message today. This is the big new idea that I think is going to transform the way we think about human nature. We're 10% B, and that has not been appreciated. Religions do, in fact, solve free rider problems, and they do, in fact, help groups cohere. Religions ask a lot of people. Some sacrifices are relatively trivial. Here's a group of Amish women who can't fully enjoy a day at the beach because of the dress codes of their religion. So these are relatively small sacrifices, you might say, but of course religions demand much greater sacrifices as well.
Such an interesting idea that we have built within us sacrifice for the group, that we would actually put our own selfish desires on hold for the greater good. And I think Heitz does a wonderful job explaining that. It reminds me of this is kind of a harsh example because it's a very socially controversial topic, but in India they have the caste system, which from our Western moral perspective is abhorrent because basically you can't live any sort of American dream whatsoever because whatever you're born into is your karma, right? And I'm not sure, this has been their historical system. It's changing now. I don't know much about their contemporary style, but throughout history they had the caste system where if you were born into a certain family with a certain job, let's say you made shoes, that was your destiny. You were not supposed to go outside of those boundaries or limitations. You were supposed to show piety to the caste, and that was just the way it was. So there was this sacrifice inbuilt where you just allowed that to happen. If you were born in power, you were born in power. If you were born impoverished, you were born impoverished. That was kind of the way it went. And the goal of life in Indian history, from what I can tell through my own research, was not so much to accomplish material gain, but to accomplish spiritual success, to unify with Brahman, the one great God of the universe. So it's interesting to see that in a Indian society. Then we can look at a Chinese history where you have the development of what they called filial piety or piety. I'm not sure which one is the preferred pronunciation, but filial piety is basically the idea that I want to make sure I'm right about this, but from what I can remember, it's the absolute worship of the emperor's rule and the absolute you serve your family. You're supposed to stay within this. It's much like that caste system. You're supposed to stay within the social structure you're in, and really that's your honor. That's your duty. Let's see here. I want to make sure I got that right real quick, though. Yeah, it's filial piety means to be good to one's parents, to take care of one's parents, to engage in good conduct, not just towards parents, but also outside the home, okay? So as to bring good name to one's parents and ancestors, to show love, respect, and support, to display courtesy, ensure male heirs, etc. Yes, and so the emperor of China was kind of considered like the pinnacle of that piety, and it's just, I know I'm off on a tangent. It's just fascinating to me, these different societies, how they've evolved for group sacrifice.
self-flagellation. People put their lives at risk. They sometimes give their lives. Very, very costly sacrifices. How could that be? How could that be adaptive? The best research on this was done by an anthropologist, Richard Sosis. What Sosis did was he collected data, reports on 200 communes, that is, intentional communities in America in the 19th century, groups that left the corrupt morals of the city, let's say, and tried to start their own community with good values that they wanted. And about half of them were secular, mostly socialist, half were religious. And what this graph shows, this is how long the communes lasted in years, and most of them were over within 10
Fascinating how the religious ones last so much longer.
years. Most of them faded away or broke up within 10 years. Most of the secular groups asked very little, but none of them lasted very long. The secular communes faded out very quickly. The black bars are the religious communes. What this shows you is that there were 4 that asked very little. And like their secular counterparts, they died out very quickly. But there were 10 communes in his data set that demanded between 3 and 5 different kinds of sacrifice, and they lasted longer. For religious communities, the more they demand of you, the more effective the moral community is at maintaining itself and lasting 60 years, on average 65 years. Quite a feat. So the take-home message from this, I think, is that gods are like maypoles. I myself am an atheist. I do not believe that there are gods in the world, but gods are very, very common human inventions. Are they just parasitic meme complexes that spread because they help themselves while...
Okay, he's talking about Dawkins, not to mention any names, Dr. Height.
Hurting us? I don't think so. I think that gods are like maypoles, that is, they are human inventions that then enable people to circle around. And when we circle around something with other people, we then trust them, and we create a moral community with them. Going forward, I'd like to replace the Williams quote with this. Morality and religiosity are adaptations produced biological process, multi-level selection, that always yields a balance of cooperative and competitive impulses. And let's replace the Dawkins quote with this. Let us embrace a realistic picture of human nature and then maximize the benefits of our hivishness while minimizing its negative externalities. Perhaps not in...
Wow, that's just so fascinating to me. The idea that we need group, the more the group demands sacrifice from us, the more that group seems to excel in their given goals. That's a fascinating notion. I also like how he was talking about how religious gods are like maypoles. People gather around them. Jung would say they're powerful archetypal forces. It's like imagine a cult. And the leader of that cult has you believing that he's the prophet and that the apocalypse is coming. And that there are certain things that you must sacrifice in order to save yourself and to save your family and to win the afterlife or whatever. And it's very convincing. And the whole group really gets into it. They are possessed by this archetype of this prophet, this representative of a god or God. Well, why is that happening? Well, we have to look at it from a psychological standpoint. There is something inside the psyche that is receptive to being in that hive, to flipping that hive switch, as Haidt calls it, into being in that group hypnosis. It's something that you've probably noticed happens to you when you're at a concert or when you're in an extremely powerful group experience of a sports game. When you are attending let's use a hockey game, for example. Hockey is an extremely violent sport. It's for anyone who's played hockey, you'll understand why. It's very frustrating to get sticks poked into you and elbows in your ribs and constantly slammed against boards. I mean, it's a frustrating sport and it's nonstop. It's not like football where you take a break after every play. You're doing it for, 20-minute periods straight. Okay, so lots of fights tend to break out in hockey. But if you're ever in the stands, you'll notice that something switches in the audience. There's this archaic impulse to want the other person from the other team to actually be hurt. Now you take that from other subpersonalities inside of you and you think, oh my God, I can't believe there's an impulse inside of me that is cheering, and most people aren't self-aware to go that far, that is cheering for someone else's pain. Well, that's another similar experience. And what would the God be? What would the maypole be in that situation? Well, you could say it's Aries. You know, it's the god of war. It's aggression. It's the ancient, archaic aggression circuit within your body being stimulated. The war circuit. You call it whatever the heck you want. It's deep inside of you. And then the Greeks were interesting enough to create representations, whether they did this consciously or inadvertently, of these deep parts of being human. We have Ares, the god of war. We have Aphrodite, the god of beauty. We have Hermes, the trickster, the negotiator, the psychopump, the communicator, the messenger. You know, we have these different, they had these different projections. In Hinduism, they have all the different gods as well. In what's the other society I'm thinking of? It's slipping my mind right now. But the point is, this is, you know, it's everywhere. It's absolutely everywhere. Oh my gosh, Shane's asking about egregores. Yes, Shane, that's very interesting. My buddy actually recently taught me about egregores. Yes, egregores is basically the concept Grizz brings up here as well, that a group of people can empower a certain archetype or energy, like Yahweh, for example, and that somehow that energy turns back on those people and develops an autonomy of its own. It's kind of a metaphysical idea, if I'm not mistaken, Grizz. I'm no expert on it because I just learned about it. To Jung, what was important was to maintain the Kantian distinction of, I know what I can experience within my psychic, meaning psychological confines. So if I'm experiencing a God or a tremendous religious experience, what I know as a phenomenologist, according to Jung, is that there is something in the psyche that is structured in such a way for me to have this experience, and that is what I know. Okay, so imagine a circle. This is a circle of what I know. Beyond the circle of what I know is the circle of, or the larger realm of things that are possible. So it's possible that there is an external God or force or archetype outside of me that is also playing into my internal dynamics, my internal psyche. But Jung maintained the distinction that we cannot know that for certain, because all we can know is that internal experience. So that's why it's the Kantian distinction. Immanuel Kant's the thing in and of itself. People want to try to know the thing in and of itself, but the reality is, and Kant was right onto this before the neuroscientists really nailed this in, the reality is that we only see what we can see with our faculties of given perception. So whatever I'm seeing right now, it may or may not reflect an actual reality out there, or it might just be an adaptive evolutionary perspective of perception that allows me to function within a world of information that is far too vast for me to possibly sort through and still maintain a human body. So we have to specify our perception enough to the point where we can actually act in the world. And that's the beauty of evolution, is specifying the species in such a way that they can get more distinct in their ability to act and their ability to survive. So, thank you all for being here. It's been a lot of fun. I don't know how long I've even been streaming, but it was a grand old time. Maybe we should play some music again real quick. My ears just got totally blown out. I can't believe that. That really hurt. I'm okay though. Thank you all for being here. This is Sorting Myself Out. My name's Ryan Holzapfel. Give this channel a like if you want. It supports the channel a lot. You can share the video, that helps, leave a comment. You can also hit the notification bell. That makes a huge difference as far as making sure you know when the videos are out, because the YouTube algorithm is absolutely unpredictable. We never know what it's going to do or when it's going to do it. For all we know, this channel could get 700,000 views tomorrow, or it could get none. So the best thing you can do as supporters is just hit the like button. Do any of the things that I just mentioned, or all of them if you want, but I don't expect that. You can also support the channel with a link in the description. All right, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful day, and it's been fun going through this topic with you. Sending you my love, and I'll be back soon.